We are going to be recording it. Yes, we're going to be recording it. So just a warning that that's happening. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we are going to use the chat in a pretty active way. We want everyone to introduce themselves, offer comments along the way, and as questions come up, please enter them in the chat. I will be monitoring the questions, and at the end of Melanie's talk, we'll come on to curate those questions for Melanie for the Q&A portion of the event. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Melanie Troy, who is going to be giving her presentation, which she's called Making Data Meaningful, Visualization for Data Communications. And Melanie joined the Roux Institute about a year ago. And one fun fact is that she had not set foot in the state of Maine until we began recruiting her for this position. So it's it is our goal here at the Roux Institute to be an engine of opportunity and talent. And it started with recruiting a wonderful team to lead our research, learning, and entrepreneurship efforts. And we consider Melanie one of the great new team members at the Roux Institute. And we're just thrilled that she chose to come to a place she didn't know well to help build this. And so what is it that Melanie does? She is the director of data visualization research at the Roux Institute. And what that means is working with her team to empower people to do more with data through the design and evaluation of novel data visualization techniques. Focus also on human data interactions and how people interact with data and use data to make decisions. And then finally, technology interfaces that allow humans to interact with data. And the fields that Melanie and her team are studying with these applications include the other core areas of Roux Institute research, including health and biological research, engineering, and the interaction between AI development and data visualization. And that is a really exciting thing because Melanie's work intersects with all other aspects of the Roux Institute work. And so she has a really good perspective on, as we're all working to move our institutions into the data century, how do people work and interact with that data? Melanie is from Canada. She grew up in Princeton, British Columbia. She got her PhD in computer science from Simon Fraser University and her BS in microbiology from the University of British Columbia. And before coming here, Melanie was at Tableau, where she managed an applied user research team and ultimately commercialized their work into Tableau's Ask Data features. She also was a faculty member previous to that at the University of Victoria. So Melanie, thank you for doing this. You are on the cutting edge of the burgeoning data visualization field, and we're thrilled that you're building here at Roux, and looking forward to your talk. And as I mentioned again, one more time, as you have questions to the audience, please put them in the chat, and I'll help curate the questions for Melanie at the end. All you, Melanie.
All right. Well, thank you, Margaret. I'm excited to be here and to share with all of you some of what I do in my research. So as Margaret mentioned, I've had this sort of odd career bouncing back and forth between academia and industry, starting from more of an academic position at the University of Victoria, and then I spent some time in industry and industry research at both Agilent Labs and then Tableau. And more recently, I've joined the Roux Institute, where I'm leading this new team to do data visualization that is relevant to our partner organizations and to problems that we have here in Maine. So what is visualization? Well, we like to define it as the use of computer-supported interactive graphic representations of data to support human activities. So it really, everything I do is about empowering people to make sense of their data and to do things with their data, use it to support awareness, decision-making, or whatever other human activity they need data to support. So let's start with a few classic examples of data visualizations. And sometimes I like to go back to some really, really old examples that that continue to inspire me. One of those is Dr. John Snow's map of cholera from the mid-1800s. There was a big cholera outbreak in London in the 1800s. Dr. Snow was trying to treat all of the cases of cholera. And this was at a time where there wasn't really a very good understanding of what actually caused the disease. It was thought that kind of bad air might be the cause, but there was not really an understanding that it traveled through water. And the innovation that Dr. Snow had was to start plotting deaths from cholera on a map of the local city. And what he noticed was that they tended to cluster. And the other great insight that he had was to start plotting other things on the map. In particular, the X's here mark water pumps. And you can see that as soon as you plot the water pumps on the map, a lot of the cases are clustered around this particular pump on Broad Street. And once he noticed that, the city shut down the pump and the cholera epidemic cleared up quite quickly after that. Another of my favorite visualizations is this one by Menard that documents Napoleon's march on Russia in the 1800s as well. This visualization is inspiring because it maps a whole lot of data in a really small space and tells a bit of a story of what happened during this military campaign. So let me take a minute and just explain it so you can see all of the different things that Menard has managed to capture in his map. The first thing this is a map. It starts on the left in France and on the right over in Moscow, and it maps the movement of troops from France over to Moscow in brown, and then their subsequent retreat in black. The width of the line here represents how many troops Napoleon had at the time. And so you can immediately see that he started with a very large number. And as his campaign progressed, the numbers shrank so that by the time he actually reached Moscow, he had less than a third of the troops that he started with, which wasn't boding well for his campaign. And by the time he retreated home, actually, they were nearly all perished, which is a very sad story. But you can see that information very clearly from the map. You can also tell that somewhere along the way, shortly after they left France, there was a break-off group that tried a different route and wasn't very successful and ended up retreating and joining the retreating troops on their way back home. They never even made it to Russia. Now, what is also interesting is this map tells the story of what happened to some extent to the troops along the way. Particularly on the retreat, it maps at the bottom here, the temperature in the outside. This was a winter retreat, and you can kind of see that as things progressed and it got colder and colder outside, this caused big problems for Napoleon's army. Also, along their retreat, they had to cross several rivers, which are mapped on the map. And those river crossings represented some major troop losses for Napoleon. And so what I love about this map is that it manages to capture this whole story of Napoleon's campaign in a single image by mapping all of these bits of data to different parts of the representation. This one is a much more recent example. This one comes from Scientific American, and it maps out a story about what's happening to wild bee populations, comparing what wild bees we had in the 1880s compared to the 2000s, where bee populations that have been lost are kind of shown in hatching, like these ones at the top left, and bee populations that still exist are shown in the darker color. And within each of the bee species, each of these dots is a species, it shows sort of red dots for bee plant interactions that have been lost. yellow ones for those interactions that have persisted, and blue ones for new interactions that have been developed between bees and plants. And you can see that among the species who have persisted, maybe one of the reasons they've survived is by being able to develop these new interactions with plants that weren't there before. And a lot of the species that have perished were relying on interactions with plants that where those interactions have been lost over time. And so what all of these visualizations do well is that several things. First of all, they're able to leverage the parallel perceptual processing that happens in our brain with visual information so that they can convey a lot of information in a small space, much more information than would be easy for us to process if we just presented this as a table of numbers. And also by revealing the information visually in this way, they allow us to see patterns in the data that we wouldn't be able to pick out from a table. They also allow us to read things at both large and small scales. If we look at that map of Napoleon's army, you can see sort of the overall big picture of what happened, but you can also kind of drill in and look at an individual river and see the losses that happened to the army at that particular point in time. Moreover, each of these visualizations has been designed specifically to support a particular task. If you wanted to do a different task or look at a different aspect of the information, you might want to design these all very differently. They've been quite deliberately designed to support the task that the author had in mind. And they do much more than just present the numbers. They actually tell a story about the numbers. They add a bit of a, even if there's not an explicit narrative here, there is an expectation of what the viewer will get out of reading the visualization. And so in visualization research, what we like to do is to build up theories and guidelines around how to build visualization tools like these that are effective and meaningful for people. And we do that using a wide variety of approaches, but I want to highlight 3 in my talk today. The first thing that we do is we go out in the world and we study how people work with data today. How do they make visualizations and data stories? What tools do they use? And what are the limitations that they encounter in the way they practice with data today that might tell us about what opportunities we could have to build better tools to enable people to do this either more easily or more effectively. The second thing we do is we try to build theories or guidelines to help people build more effective visualizations. And we do that typically by running experiments with human participants looking at things like human perception, human cognition, and how design influences the reading or the interaction with visualizations. And the third thing we do is that we build new things. So we prototype new visualization types and new tools for creating visualizations or interacting with visualizations. And then we evaluate those by putting them in front of people who would use them and assessing whether they make it easier or faster to accomplish certain tasks. And so what I thought I'd do in my talk today is just share an example from my past work of each of these rather different approaches. So I've got 3 examples to share with you. Assuming we get through them, I can talk forever. So we might have to rush through the end bit depending on how long it takes me. So let's start with the first one, understanding current practice. And for this one, I want to keep up the theme here of data-driven storytelling that kind of comes out of those examples that I used at the beginning of the talk. And so what we wanted to do in this research was to understand the practices of data storytelling. I think all of us are familiar with visualizations along the lines of these ones that you see here. These are visualizations that appeared in the BBC, especially over the last couple of years with the pandemic, we've all gotten pretty used to seeing visualizations in the news. And big newsrooms like the BBC or the Guardian or the Washington Post have big teams of data storytellers who are experts at telling stories with data and building these kinds of visualization tools that can be understandable by the general public. And so what we wanted to understand was, what are the practices of these expert data storytellers? What is it that they do that maybe the rest of us could learn from, that maybe could be applied within organizations that don't have expert data storytellers, like in businesses who need to work with data? And what are the barriers that even expert data storytellers encounter in their work process that we might be able to address by building new tool support? And so to understand how data storytellers work, we ran an interview study. We interviewed 9 data storytelling professionals. They worked at places like The Guardian, The Washington Post, Spiegel Online, and so on. So these were all major news organizations. And they had different roles in these organizations. Some were data journalists, some were editors, some were programmers, and so on. And in our interviews, we focused in on 1 or 2 data stories that the participant had worked on. And we focused on the process that they went through and the tools they used in building and publishing their data story. So a couple of examples. This example I used of where the wild bees are is one that one of our participants discussed in their interview. So that's that was the motivation for me using this example in the talk. Another one of the examples that our interviewees discussed was this story called Unwanted in a magazine, Interactive Things, or an online magazine. This data story is all about infanticide in India of girls, and sort of the tree that you see here shows the progression from what happens if the first child is male, female, what happens with the second child and the third child, and so on. And this was a sort of scrolly telling story, where as you scroll down through the page, new information appears. So these are examples of the kinds of data stories that our participants talked about. And they took us through the whole process that they went through, right from the beginning of imagining the story or starting with some data, right through to the actual production. And each one of these was actually quite different, but they had many common elements. And we took those common elements of their process and put it together into this visual model that helped us to describe what the process of storytelling is. Now, it looks complicated, but I'll kind of break it down. There's really 3 parts to creating a data story. One part is to make a story. And that means that the author has to somehow find and construct pieces of the story, little facts that they want to share, backed up by evidence, and they need to kind of put those together into a plot, put an ordering around them to create a story to tell. Now, one of the things that surprised us here was that actually this was often the first step. The first step was that the journalist had an idea in mind for a story, and then they would go and seek data that would support or refute their story to decide whether that really was a good story to tell. And that was kind of counterintuitive to us as visualization people, where we often thought you start from the data. In fact, data storytellers often started from a story they thought they wanted to tell. And that meant they then had to go and get data. So they had to find it, and they had to explore that data to find out whether it really supported the story or whether there was maybe a different story there. And then they had to excerpt pieces of all of the exploration that they did that could become parts of the final story that would be delivered. And of course, there's a lot more exploration and a lot of dead ends along the way that they encounter that they throw out. Sometimes they get stuck here, not even being able to find data relevant to the story. And so the story dies at that point. or they run into challenges kind of merging the necessary data sources to get them to their answer, and so on. So this is a big step. And then they need to tell a story by taking all that story material, building it into some kind of a presentation, whether that's a written article with data visualizations, or an online article, or whatever it might be. And then they need to publish that and then get feedback from the audience in the form of comments and so on. And then, of course, there's many other outside factors that end up influencing the story production process, like the time that they have to make the story, the medium it will go into, and so on. Now, depending on the size of the newsroom, these different roles might all be played by one person, or might actually be split up among many different people. So there's also a kind of collaboration that happens between, say, a scripter and an editor and a data analyst to make these stories appear. And so by looking at this storytelling process and observing the problems that people encountered along the way, we were able to identify a bunch of opportunities where research might be able to help the data storytelling process. One is in the kind of early data wrangling process and integrity checking. We had one of our interviewees was trying to deal with hospital data, looking at hospital bed availability over a period of many years. And a challenge he had was that hospitals would close, or they would change their name, or they would change the number of beds that they had in a particular ward. And so trying to align the data from these different years across all of the hospitals was an incredibly challenging process. So building tools that help with that kind of data wrangling would be incredibly helpful. We also found that data storytellers had trouble just finding data. They had an idea for a story, but what sort of open source data might be out there that could support or refute their story idea? Having tools that support data search could be helpful here. They also had to go from data exploration, there's lots of tools to support that, but then start to put things together into sequences. And that's a process that was very manual. Similarly, rapidly prototyping what the story ideas might be. These were all done with very manual tools like image editors and so on. They had to port between different formats, and they had to collaborate with each other, and visualization tools to date haven't really been designed with collaboration support in mind. And so this kind of research elucidated for us the many different things that we could do to support the storytelling process, and that inspired further research. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears and talk about a very different kind of research, thinking about doing experiments with people to build some theories about what kinds of visualization interfaces might be useful and when we should use them. And this particular experiment that I'm going to talk about is one we entitled, "Would You Like a Chart with That?" which was all about imagining that we wanted to build a visualization chatbot, some way that you could talk with your mobile phone and ask questions about data, and what kind of answers should that data interface provide to you. One of our inspirations was looking at something that Google does. If you go to Google today and you type in the question, what is the population of Peru? Google gives you this very interesting answer. It could just give you, 32 point something million. That is the literal answer, but it actually does a bit more than that in a way that is sort of nice. One of the things it does is to show you a timeline of how the population of Peru has changed over time. That's the blue line here. And even more than that, it actually adds a couple of other South American countries that might be similar to Peru to give you some context about how Peru compares to other similar nations. So we wondered, this all seems like a very nice answer, but is this the kind of answer that people would expect to data questions that they would ask of a chatbot, when would they want to see all this extra detail, and what kind of extra detail would they like to see? And when might they just prefer the simple terse answer of roughly 33 million? And so to answer that question, we set out to do an actual experimental comparison. And so we ran an experiment using a crowdsourced platform that allows you to get many people to do simple tasks with interfaces. In our case, it was basically a questionnaire. And we compared different ways of presenting data answers that a chatbot may give. We asked the people in our study to imagine that they were interacting with a data chatbot, and they were asking it questions about some past Olympic medals data. And we gave them several possible responses that the chatbot might give, and asked them to rank order those in the order of their preference. And so the possible answers looked like some of these. The simple answer was text only. So here the person is supposed to imagine that they've asked the question, are there more events in weightlifting or taekwondo? And the candidate chatbot answer is the chatbot just saying, weightlifting has 15 events compared to taekwondo's 8. We contrasted that with a version where the chatbot would give the text answer, but also a little chart showing the difference. And a version where the chatbot provided the chart with more context. So in addition to just including weightlifting and taekwondo, it includes a bunch of other events at the Olympics, so that you can see that, you know, weightlifting has 15, but that's still minuscule compared to track that has many more, but much more than something like archery that only has 4 events. And then we also compared an example where there was an explicit difference. This was a different particular input question, but it shows that, you know, it does an actual explicit difference between the two things that were asked, and shows that as an add-on. And so we wanted to see, when would different people want to see these different kind of answers? What would be an effective chatbot? And what we found was kind of interesting. It wasn't a clear-cut answer. There were sort of what we would call text people and what we would call chart people. So participants tended to either prefer one or the other. Some really liked the super simple, just give me the text answer. Others preferred the more elaborate charts. What was interesting about the people who preferred charts is they always tended to prefer the more elaborate ones that gave extra context, like this middle one that you see here, as opposed to the one on the bottom left. So 41% of the people just like the simple text answer, and the other 59% preferred a chart. And we also asked them a bunch of questions to try to get at why it was that they would prefer one or the other. And so we asked questions like, we asked them to agree with statements like, it shows exactly the information that I asked for and nothing more. It shows me additional information that might be interesting to me, even though I didn't ask it. And we also asked them to agree or disagree with how much they just liked charts in general, because we thought if they really just liked charts, that might influence their answers. And so we found that the people who really liked text tended to like the fact that it gave exactly the information they wanted and no more. And the people who tended to like charts appreciated the extra context that the chart could provide. And so, you know, there were many more questions that we asked in our paper, but some of the key conclusions were, first, that if we were going to show a chart in a chatbot like this, it was more useful to show more context than just the explicit things asked. So we should infer more information that might be useful to share. And secondly, that as a developer of a chatbot, we should kind of build the chatbot in a way that it could get to know the user and kind of personalize the information to them. That perhaps over time it could learn from the user what their preferences were and use that to kind of diverge and show some users one thing and other users another thing. And that might be a more helpful way to design the chatbot. So that's an example of a simple experiment that helps us build theories about design. The last part of my talk, I want to share the third approach to research, which is really building new things. And for this example, I want to go back to the challenge that we identified in the storytelling part of the talk around collaboration with data. We saw that those data storytellers often needed to work as a team with different people having different roles, and that there was some friction in how you would kind of share data from one person to the other in the transitions between these roles. And so we wanted to evaluate ways that we might be able to overcome those collaboration challenges with data. So we envisioned two common scenarios that happen when people are working with data around visualization workbooks. The first one is imagining that two people are kind of cooperating or working together in editing a visualization workbook, where a workbook is kind of a collection of visualizations compiled into a single document, kind of like tabs in a spreadsheet. So let's imagine that Sam has been working on some visualizations and he sends an email to Sarah with his visualization workbook. And Sarah takes that workbook and kind of adds on. She maybe creates some new visualizations and changes some. And then she sends that workbook back to Sam, who is going to now further continue the analysis. But before he can continue the analysis, Sam has to have kind of an understanding of, well, what did Sarah change? Do those changes make sense to me? Where should I start now? And so the challenge for him is, how do I get up to speed? A related scenario would involve someone being more of a reviewer type of role. So again, let's start with Sam building his visualization workbook. He's going to pass it to Sarah, who is, instead of editing that workbook directly, Sarah's going to provide some feedback to Sam about his visualizations and how they could be better. He's going to take that feedback and apply it to edit his visualizations, maybe make some new ones, and then send his edited version back to Sarah. Now, Sarah doesn't probably want to review the whole thing again. That could be rather time intensive, especially if this goes back and forth many times. Sarah would rather like to know, what exactly did Sam change since the last version I saw? I want to check only the things he changed in relation to the feedback that I gave. And so all of this comes down to someone essentially needing to see, well, what actually changed since the last version that I saw, and how can I kind of reconcile the differences between these two versions so that this interaction can be efficient and effective. So how does this happen today? Well, it's actually a rather painful process to compare visualization states over time. Our people who we talk to about their collaboration practice tended to tell us that they do one of two things. Either there's super lengthy documentation. So like when Sam updates the workbook in response to Sarah's feedback, he might document for her all of the changes that he made and send that back. And so this is an excerpt of an example of this kind of like, here's all the things that I changed that you might want to pay attention to when you look at it. That works, but it's a bit onerous to have to document all these things, and some of the details might get left out. The other thing that people do is direct side-by-side comparison. So this is an example from Tableau workbooks. This is just the same workbook in two different versions of it, placed side by side. And the analyst here is going to look at these two things and try to compare what exactly has been changed from one to the other. This works fine, except that, you know, it makes big changes obvious. Obviously, this stacked bar chart got turned into a side-by-side bar chart, and some color scheme changes happened. But it makes more subtle things a little harder to notice. The analyst might not notice that this sum aggregation got changed into an average that may not be very visible from a visual inspection. And yet that change of aggregation type might be really, really important to the meaning of the data that's here. So to make these kinds of comparisons easier, we decided to try to prototype a new approach. And our prototyping first took the form of lots and lots of sketching. We had a big sketchbook, and we just kept trying different ideas. Well, what if we did this? And what if we did that? And we would reason about them with each other and just try many, many things until we iterated to something that made sense. A lot of our early attempts ended up not being good. We threw those away and we tried new things until we got to something that seemed worthwhile to build out further. So this is a very iterative design process. And eventually we came to this prototype that we called ChangeCatcher, because it is intended to catch changes between versions of workbooks. And it worked at kind of two scales. So this is the high level scale, where you could see at a very high level how many changes of what types happen between versions. So between versions 1 and 2, between versions 2 and 3, and so on. So there's 6 different versions of this workbook. Anything in blue meant that a tab was added to the workbook. Anything in red or orange meant that a tab was removed. And anything in gray meant that a tab or a sheet, same thing, was changed. More interestingly is to drill into one of these bars to see the details. And so I'm not going to get into all the details of how this works. It's not super important. The key thing is that we built it to work around an existing tool. So we didn't want to mess with the interface of the tool the analyst was familiar with. In our case, we were working with Tableau. So this whole thing in the orange box is just the standard Tableau interface as an analyst would be used to seeing. We didn't change anything there. We just wanted to add on extra information about what had changed. So all the stuff that we added was kind of around this existing interface. We took all of the sheets in the workbook. These are like tabs like you would have in a spreadsheet. Each one is a visualization, and we just kept all of those same tabs in their same order. On the other axis, we put the different kinds of changes that had happened, and we broke these down into different things. Like, for example, there was a change in the visual encoding. In other words, the way that data was mapped into a chart, or there was a change to the formatting or to the actual data that was included in the chart. And in this way, we thought that that might help an analyst to filter out changes they didn't care about. Like, if I was only concerned about content changes in the charts and I didn't care about how they were formatted and what fonts and colors were used, I could ignore all the formatting changes, for example. And then the core of how we showed what had changed was to map onto table cells in between these two axes and color in whenever there was a change in one of the workbook sheets that matched one of those types. So that's these colored bars. So like in this table sheet, there's been a change in the filters that are applied. And if you hover over these little bars, it then gives you more detail about what had changed. So this was our ChangeCatcher prototype. It was a very early prototype. It kind of allowed you to interact with it, but it wasn't actually built into the Tableau tool. was more meant to illustrate what this interaction would look like if we built it for real. And before we would build it for real, we wanted to see if this would actually help analysts with these kind of collaboration tasks. And so we did an experimental comparison where we brought in a collection of potential users and had them do an experimental comparison where on the one hand, they just used Tableau as it was, and on the other hand, they used Tableau with the ChangeCatcher additions so that we could compare the extra value or non-value, if that was the case, of what ChangeCatcher would do for them in these kind of handoff tasks from one collaborator to another. And so they had to do a task imagining that they'd received an updated workbook from a collaborator and they would have to compare the two versions. They had to answer some questions about the differences and then do an in-depth comparison of what had changed. And what we found was that the version with ChangeCatcher made it much, much easier for them to find and reconcile those changes. One of the reasons, actually, that it was so beneficial was that without it, they spent a lot of time making detailed comparisons to be sure that they hadn't missed something that had changed. So it was actually the things that hadn't changed that were, in a way, harder to be certain of because you were wary that you might have missed something, and so you spent more time. If there actually was a change, you could find it and you knew you were done. And so the benefits of this prototype were that it increases people's confidence that they have actually seen and understood all of the changes, that they haven't missed particular things, and it allowed them to rapidly narrow in on the changes that mattered to them. All right, so those are some examples of the types of research that we do. At the Roux Institute, we're taking all of these different approaches and applying them to new problems that are relevant to things being done here in Maine. As Margaret mentioned in the beginning, we're applying them in several different vertical areas, especially engineering and computational medicine and biology and business intelligence. And there will be more than that, but that's kind of where we're starting. And then we're looking at various visualization problems that can apply in a general way across those different sectors. So that includes topics like augmented and virtual reality, or how humans interact with AI in these different disciplines. And so I'm going to end my talk there and move into questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. That was fantastic. It's really fun to see you run through all the different areas that you're focused on. We got some great questions. Many of them were chatted directly to us. So I'm going to be the medium for the questions.
Excellent.
The first one was in reaction to your first example around the data storytelling. We wanted to understand how you looked at implicit bias when the storytellers are deciding the story and then going after the data. So how do you look at implicit bias and where it comes into play?
That is certainly true. I mean, every story, a story by its very nature has a focus. And that's not, you know, a good journalist will not try to focus in a place that there's no data to support. That's part of their training, is to provide the evidence and to choose the story to tell that is supported by the evidence they see. Of course, that's not necessarily always what happens in the news, but good journalism practice would be to do that. And in data storytelling, that's no different. You know, they explore many, many different things that might become points in their story. Some of them are just uninteresting, and so they naturally get left off. Others are more interesting or fit in with the narrative, and so those get included. And you hope that the integrity of the journalist is that they only choose to tell story points that are actually well supported by evidence in the data.
All right, I really like the next question, which is, it seems like an implicit assumption in data visualization is that there's no verbal communication with it. But in all of your examples, you gave the story verbally with them. Are there discussions about the value of including a very short narrative or audio with data visualization tools?
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, and actually becoming a bit of a hot topic in the visualization field. When I was working at Tableau, we worked a lot with data dashboards. Tableau is essentially a dashboarding tool. And what we heard from a lot of our customers is that while some people were quite content to just, go to a dashboard every morning or every week and look at their current numbers, there were other users who really wanted a bit of a narrative to go along with it. They wanted a narrative that would tell them the most important things or highlight things that had changed. And so that got me thinking along the lines of, well, what could we do in terms of building narratives that highlight data facts or that highlight a story to go along with something like a dashboard? And I would say that's actually kind of a hot topic in visualization research right now. It's something that's being actively investigated and being more and more understood that, visualization alone certainly tells a story, but there are a lot of times you might want to have an actual presentation along with it or a narrative along with it.
And it's interesting to think about all the different applications. You've talked obviously about journalism, but one of the visualization conversations we've had is if you're on a manufacturing floor and you're getting a lot of data coming out of what you're working on, how do you work quickly? There's not going to be a lot of narrative to go with that. So definitely different categories and different scenarios have different.
Yeah, that's actually a super interesting one, just because if you're on a factory floor, you're not sitting in front of a visualization tool and digging into data for hours and hours, which is what most visualization tools are designed to do today. Yeah. It's a secondary part of your job, and we need to think about how we design a visualization tool to be secondary to your primary work. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to dig into in my research.
All right, I think we have time for a couple more questions. There's some really good ones here. What's the best way to visualize and present qualitative and quantitative data together?
Qualitative and quantitative data together. I'm going to assume that qualitative means something like written comments. Is that your interpretation, Margaret?
Yes.
Yeah. That is a tricky one that's not solved super well today. There are a whole host of text analytics and visualization techniques out there. I wouldn't say that we've nailed that problem. Typically, what they do is try to either extract some sort of summaries of the text or themes that reappear across many, many text documents, or sentiment of, is the text having a positive leaning or a negative. That would be especially true in something like social media tweets or something like this. Are the tweets positive or negative, or what topics are trending? And then we typically build visualizations on top of those extracted bits of information, whether they're topics or sentiment or whatever, and we might map that over time. It really depends on the question or the task that we're ultimately trying to support with the visualization. But qualitative data is a big challenge in the viz field. Quantitative is much, much easier.
So I've got two questions, and apologies to the audience members who sent them, because I'm going to sort of mush them together, but they're very related. So there was a question about how can we quantitatively measure improvement in perception or cognition that can be enabled by data visualization? And so I love that question because it's how can data visualization actually improve our own abilities, the human ability to digest and make decisions based on data? The other question we got was about the analysis that you showed between chart people and graph people, and the question of reinforcing their cognition by giving them only what they want. So I think these are related questions, and it's about how does the tools of data visualization help people improve their own ability, and do we reinforce where people are or help them advance in their own cognitive abilities?
So the question about how we measure it is typically through quantitative perceptual type experiments. We will give someone a task to do, we'll give them 2 or more different interfaces, in other words, different kinds of visualizations to accomplish that task. And then we'll start to measure the time it takes them to get to the answer and the accuracy of those answers. And typically with perceptual kind of experiments, we try to boil it down to kind of really the minimal task that we can envision, like for example, a judgment in the difference of 2 bars. For example, if you have a bar chart, you present them 2 different bars, they have to judge, which bar is greater. And then we adjust, the relative size of those bars and things like this. We might compare a bar chart versus a pie chart and assess how quickly they can judge the difference. That's the kind of experiment that we would run. For cognitive issues, we might give them a more complicated task, a more complicated visualization, but the principle is the same. It boils down to how quickly and accurately can they answer some task with different kinds of tools, and then we do the statistical analysis to assess it. The second part of your task was interesting in that, sort of, are we reinforcing a bias that people have by giving them what they want? That is interesting and certainly possibly true, right? I mean, we're by not giving them charts, we are failing to expose them to charts and maybe failing to increase their visual literacy, for example. That is certainly possible, and something that you ought to consider as a designer. How important is that? It's definitely a consideration in things like visualization recommender systems, where the system is trying to help you do your analysis work by suggesting charts that you might want to see with your data. And there's a risk with that it might take you down a path or take everybody down the same path and avoid taking you down other paths that might also be interesting or relevant. So they can be really helpful, but there is that risk associated.
I think it's an interesting intersection also between research and learning, right? Like through your work, you're offering different tools, but then we also have to think about our organizations. How does everybody in the organization learn how to use data differently? And that includes, improving your ability to digest the data. All right, yeah. Last question. Would love to talk a little bit more about interactive visualizations, ones that give deeper or different data stories based on the user's interaction with them.
What would you like to know about that?
They just want to learn more about that. Where's that field going? I mean, I can sort of read between the lines, but how in depth are those tools in development? Where do they come from? Who's developing them?
It is interaction is probably the core of data visualization research today. I used a lot of static examples just because they're easier to talk about in a presentation, and some of what we do is around the visual layout and design. But a lot of what we do in my field is think about the interaction and the flow through a visualization and how you would design that interaction to support different tasks and flexibility of different tasks. And those tools can get as simple or as complicated as makes sense for the scenario. So in something like a data journalism example, you absolutely get interactive tools, but they tend to be fairly simple because they need to be rapidly consumed, because a reader of an article in the New York Times isn't going to spend very much time learning how to use the visualization or digging into it. And they have to be understandable by a broad population of people who aren't necessarily data experts. But when we get into something like building customized visual analytics tools for genomics scientists, then we can make those tools very, very complex, because even though the tool is complex, the scientist has a complex enough analysis problem, and probably the reason they're asking us for help is because their existing tools don't get them to the answer. And so if they can learn that tool and learn the approach, and it helps them come to any kind of new insight about their data, then it's easily worth their time. And so those tools can get very complicated, and on the surface maybe look ridiculously complicated to a new viewer, but may actually be very powerful.
Well, Melanie, it's 1 o'clock. It's now time to say thank you. There's a bunch of people who are already thanking you in the chat. We're grateful for the hour you spent going deeper into this burgeoning field. And I just want to, draw a last connection across our speaker series. Our last speaker was Ray Winslow, who's our director of computational medicine research. And one of his, top line headlines from his talk was making the algorithm a member of the care team, right? And if that algorithm is part of the care team has to interact with it. And I think it's the perfect way of demonstrating how the field of data visualization is absolutely essential to the other fields that we're working on and deepening here at the Roux Institute. And
yeah, I had a slide about that.
Oh, good. Get to it. This is it, right? And I think that this is what we're trying to build here, and this incredible community of researchers who want to work with each other on these complex and really high impact areas. My final connection to the other speaker series, Jennifer Chase, I saw made a comment about wanting to see more data visualization in the field of education. And earlier in our speaker series, we featured Alicia Jalbert from Lewiston Public Schools, who has recently enrolled here as a master's in data science student, because she's also interested in the field of data science as it relates to education. And so I'm grateful for everyone for coming, for seeing these connections. It's part of our job here to help make people connect people across these interest areas. We're grateful for everyone spending an hour with us. And Rachel will put a link in to the rest of the speaker series, so you folks can register for more talks. And have a great afternoon. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And if anyone is interested and wants to reach out, please feel free. I'll put my email back up on the screen for you for a second while we wrap up. But thank you for attending.
Thanks, everyone.